Okay, next up we're going to create some controllers for our skeleton here. And of course name them correctly, and we'll go through the process of making sure that they have clean translations and rotations before we connect them into anything. So to create my controllers, what I like to use is this very simple NURBS primitive, and it's a circle. Now that circle comes in like a circle, funny enough. But if I right click and hold on that, I get this option to select control vertex. Control vertex lets me come in and adjust the shape of that circle. So for example, if I wanted to create something, and if you want to be able to select that circle again, you have to right click on it and go to object mode. If I wanted to create something that just sits outside my wrist here, but in an unobtrusive way and vaguely shaped as if to suggest, hey, by the way, I'm a wrist controller, don't you want to use me? As if it seems to say. So you'll notice that while I'm trying to select these control vertices, if I'm dragging my selection box around the skeleton at the same time, it will actually just go ahead and select the skeleton. So I'm going to set that skeleton to reference for the time being, because remember I added it to this layer joints here, which means I should now be able to, grab my control vertices without accidentally selecting that skeleton as well. For this part of the exercise, we don't actually need to be selecting that skeleton. So I'm having fun just creating this little controller, but really, I'm probably spending entirely too much time on it. Okay, let's call it done. So what I've got now is I've got this right wrist controller, and I want to have a, left wrist controller. And I want to have a right wrist controller in exactly the same spot. Now remember, our shoulders were mirrored, so if I use the skeleton as my pivot point, I should be able to duplicate that controller over. Now I've snapped this into position here at the center of the wrist, because each of our little joints, you can't see it, but there's actually a vertice at the very center of that joint. Which means if you were to grab your controller and move it away, you can bring it right back by holding down V, and you'll notice when I hold down V, that little square at the center of my manipulator becomes a circle. If I hold down V, I can then snap it to any vertice, V for vertice, on screen, including the vertices at the very center of my skeleton. Okay, so I want to make sure that this flips over and becomes its mirror opposite on the other side. And I don't want it to just become a mirror opposite on top of itself, which is exactly what it would do if I were to go do duplicate special right now. You'll see that it just created the mirror opposite right on top of itself. So instead, what I want is for it to flip around using this central bone as a pivot point. So to change the pivot point, I'm going to hold down D, and you'll see again, if I hold down D, my manipulator changes from these arrows to these little sticks. I'm going to hold down D, and if I hold down V at the same time, I can then snap that pivot point straight to any vertice, including the vertice at the very center of my skeleton. So you'll see that the controller remains in place, but now its manipulator is at the center of that skeleton. So if I go to Edit, Duplicate Special, Options, now by default, it's going to come in as exactly what it is. But if I set the scale to be -1 on the x-axis, it means it will flip to the opposite side along the x as facing the opposite direction. So if I hit apply now, you'll see that it's done exactly that, created its mirror opposite on the other side. Before I do anything else, remember the purpose of these creating these controls was to make sure we had 0 transformations here, so that if I say zeroed all that out, it would go to a default position. But right now the default position is a center of world space, which is not useful to us. So what we're going to do is do something called freeze history. Freeze history. Freeze transforms and delete history. Freeze transforms will freeze all these transformations, so translations, rotations, and scale, at 0, 0, thereby telling Maya that this is its actual position in the world. We're also going to center pivot, so that pivot point is back at the center of the object. And we'll delete history so that this make NURB circle node is no longer associated with this controller. We want it to be a clean entity. So I can find freeze transforms under the modify menu at the very top of my window, and there's freeze transforms there. You'll see that it's automatically zeroed all that out. It's of course created a new history for me, so I want to clean all that history up. So I'll go to edit, delete by type, history, and now it's a nice clean node. And finally I'll go to modify and center pivot, and that will do exactly as it promises, and it centers that pivot. Okay, last thing, let's make sure that we have actually named this. So I always prefix with what that object type is. Now I've created on my custom shelf down here, I've got freeze transforms, history, center pivot, and that creating a custom shelf just saves a lot of time, so I highly recommend that. Okay, let's name that and then go forth and create a lot more controllers. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a circle here on the ground, which I will use to duplicate all the controllers that I will, in the future, be working with. That way I don't have to go up to create circle every single time. Okay, let's create one for the feet. And I have snapped that to the toe for now. I'm going to do something a little bit tricky with that. I'll show you in a minute. Let's give that a very quick shape. Again, make sure that my joints are on reference. And I'm a bit silly in that I kind of like my controllers to just slightly resemble the things that they're controlling. Just as a visual reference. You're seeing me mess up my screen right now. As to say, hey, by the way, what you're working on right now, that's a foot. Guess what? And that's the right foot. So, it's not the most styling of feet shapes, but it gets the job done. Once again, I will change the pivot point to a central point on the body. And I'm actually going to add duplicate special to my custom shelf. So when I go up to edit, I'm going to hold down Control and Shift and select duplicate special, and you see that pops up on my shelf here. And there it is there. So let's just quickly delete history, center pivots, and drop some names on there. I imagine many of you are currently fast forwarding through the video as we speak. That's okay, I forgive you. Chances are I'm going to fast forward through this myself soon in the future. Okay, so we have wrists, we have feet. Let's create one for the pelvis. We want it to be able to sit and do squats, which you know, everybody could be doing more of those. They're good, very good for you. And I need to be able to at least see the controller on the outside of the body. If I can't, it just makes it very difficult to work with. So, do that one, and very quickly I'm going to create a duplicate and add it to the waist, I'm also going to rotate that the opposite direction, just so I have some visual guide that one of these is not like the other. Okay, let's clean these up. This is just such a good habit to get into. You are going to hate yourself forever if you don't freeze transforms and delete history on your controllers before you connect them together. So let's control but. Now let's call it what it is. Control squats. And control waste. Finally, let's give ourselves, well, next to finally anyways. Let's give ourselves controller for the head and neck. Clean that up, freeze transforms, history, center pivot, and of course name it correctly. The last thing I want to do is I want to create some controllers that are going to allow me to pivot the elbows and the knees backwards and forwards. So as an example, it's these controllers which allow me to twist the leg. So, since this is the last controller I'll be using, second to last, I lied. Okay, I will bring that out, and I'm going to create myself a cute little star shape. Because why the hell not? And let's rotate that by 90 degrees. And I want to snap that straight to the center of my knee joint. Of course, scaling it down to be roughly the same size as my knee joint. And before I do anything else, I'm going to duplicate it to create its fellow for the other side, because I want to be able to drag them out and position them together at the same time. Now, positioning for your knee constraints, very important that you position far enough away that the leg can completely articulate between that positioning and where the IK handle is going to sit. If these constraints are actually within that range of motion, you'll get a lot of very strange effects. Okay, so these are definitely going to be frozen transforms, delete history, center pivots, and we'll name them, of course, because that's just how we roll. And we'll do our elbows. We'll do a master controller. We'll call it a day and go have a cup of tea or something. Or we'll create constraints and IK handles. Okay, I have my controls for the knees. Now let's just duplicate that again and create similar ones for the elbows. Duplicate that one more time, drop it to the other elbow, grab both of those, bring them out, again creating enough room for that arm to fully articulate through. Freeze transforms, delete history, center pivot, and naming. And right elbow. Okay, last but not least, I'm going to snap this controller to the center of his body first, and then I'm going to hold down X to snap the grid and just drag on that Y axis until I can see that I have indeed, well, I've certainly snapped where his feet are. It's not where the grid is, but I'm quite happy to stop here and then drag the whole character down later. Okay, so let's make that a bit bigger so that we can always see it. And this is going to be our master controller. This lets us move the entire character around space. Of course, we're going to freeze transforms, delete history, and center pivot because we would be crazy not to. Now it currently says Control Master 1 because there is another master controller associated with Yolanda. So if I was really, really good, which apparently I wasn't. If I was really good, I would have named all of these controls for the character that I've actually created them for. Now I can actually still do that. So if I select all of these controls that I've recently created, and I go up to Modify, Prefix Hierarchy Names, I can come in here and add a prefix. So I will change that to TinyTot. And you'll see that now all those controllers have been named for TinyTot. And I can, of course, do the same thing for all the joints as well. So if you just hold down Shift and click on the plus in the outliner, it will show everything in that joint chain. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Now, warning, this is not how you name things if you're going to be exporting this to a game engine. But you may name it this way if you're going to be using it for an animation or a film. Okay, so I have all my controllers set up at this point. They are all named appropriately. They have all had their transformations frozen, and I am now ready to set up the inverse kinematics that are going to drive my arms and legs, as well as the constraints that are going to allow these controllers to move this puppet around, which we will do in the next video.